Very nice.
Right, I shall now mute everybody. So you'll have to listen to me. I'm terribly sorry about that. But first of all, let me welcome all of you to what is going to be a very, very interesting and I hope it's not quite argumentative, but stimulating afternoon. So welcome to you all. The session will be recorded, assuming the technology works, because I have actually pressed the button, so that's great. Before we start, can I remind you all of the appeal for funds from Muswell Hill Food Bank and Muswell Hill Soup Kitchen? And those of you who feel inclined to donate will find links to both sites on the invitation that I sent out earlier today. So please make your donations directly to them. So after that, welcome to Lawrence Cohen, whom I now can't find on the screen, but I presume he's there. There he is. So let's unmute Lawrence if I can, or ask Lawrence to unmute himself.
Hang on.
Right, you are unmuted.
Am I? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent.
So, yes, so great welcome to Lawrence. We're delighted to have him coming to talk to us. Lawrence, as many of you no doubt will know, was born and raised in Liverpool, which isn't quite as good as being born and raised in Manchester, but is a close approximation. But he then made up for it by going to Manchester University to take a law degree, so that's okay then, really. He qualified as a solicitor in '82 and practiced for 16 years, and then became a deputy district judge in 1993 and a full-time district judge, except for this Wednesday afternoon, of course, in 1998. And he's been a full-time judge ever since. Now, he didn't say, but I will say that I guess that being a judge is a very, very demanding profession at the best of times, and especially nowadays with all problems associated with coronavirus. So I'm delighted that Lawrence will tell us all about, or selected stories of, judging in the coronavirus era. Now, when Lawrence has finished, he said he would welcome questions, comments, and discussion. So at that point, if you have questions, comments, or things you want to discuss, please wave a hand or something, and with a bit of luck, I will unmute you. But meanwhile, please stay muted while we listen to Lawrence. So Lawrence, over to you.
David, thanks a lot for that very kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to your amazing Top of the Hill series. For those of you who might not know me, I think everybody does, but I'll say anyway, I've been a member of Muswell Hill with Deborah for about 35 years, since the children were very young. So I know you all. I'm going to start by telling you briefly about my background and how I became a district judge. Then I'll tell you about the sort of work that I do and how I do it. I'll tell you a bit about what's happened to my work since coronavirus. And finally, I'll try and guess briefly what judging might look like in the future. I'll talk for about probably 35 minutes or so, something like that. And I hope, as David says, there'll be plenty of time for questions, comments, and all that sort of thing afterwards. My wife, Deborah, and I were born in Liverpool, as David said, and went to King David High School, along with nearly all of the other Liverpudlians who were members of our shul. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up. My father had a wallpaper shop, and my parents didn't know anything about higher education. Noting that I was good at maths, the geography teacher, who under sufferance doubled as the careers master, announced with confidence that I should be an optician. And that was the sum total of my career's guidance. So I asked my friends what they were going to do. I couldn't stand the sight of blood, so medicine was out. I was no good at art, so an arts degree was pointless. I eliminated university courses one by one until I was left with law. So I applied to do a law degree. There were no lawyers in the family. I was the first to go to university, actually. and I thought it would be something of a feather in my cap. Plus, maybe, after I could make a decent living at the same time. I got a place at Manchester University, marking one of my very first essays at the law faculty. My professor remarked, "Well done, you think like a lawyer." It was a career-defining moment for me. I took up articles in Liverpool and spent 2 years taking statements from Liverpool scallywags. There was definitely great honour amongst thieves, and whole families of criminals were well known around Liverpool. I remember an old lag from the Kinsella family who came into my office bursting with pride as he introduced me to his youngest son, the final member of his family to get nicked. At the tender age of 14, he was charged with stealing a car. The dad sat down opposite me at my desk. He ostentatiously placed a packet of 10 Woodbine cigarettes on the table and gently pushed it towards me with a wink and said, "I know you'll look after him, Mr. Cohen. You'll see him all right." I was thrilled to be taken into his trust. I qualified in 1982, and Deborah and I immediately came down to London to seek our fame and fortune. I found work at a small solicitor's practice in Uxbridge, defending people trying to smuggle drugs into the country through Heathrow Airport. Some of their methods were quite ingenious. Cannabis was woven into the plaited handles of wicker baskets or hidden in the heels of shoes. One man tried to smuggle in cocaine, hidden in the shoulder pads of his jacket. Remember those jackets with great big shoulder pads? He was caught when a customs officer tapped him on the shoulder and was overcome by a huge puff of white powder. In the 2 years I worked at Kurtz & Company solicitors, every one of my clients was convicted, and they were all deported at the end of their sentence, so I didn't get any repeat business either. Not an auspicious start. After 10 years or so, I started my own practice in Wood Green here in London with an old school friend of mine. My speciality was litigation, and nearly every day I attended court as an advocate. My local court was Edmonton, and the senior district judge there was a chap, a lovely old Welshman called Gerald Rose. One day at the end of a case, he kept me back and said he wanted to have a word with me. I immediately thought I'd done something wrong, but instead, he asked me a question that would change the course of my life. He said, "Lawrence, have you ever thought of doing what I do? Do you want to be a judge?" Well, I was gobsmacked, completely amazed. He said that I'd impressed him as an advocate, and he thought I was up to the job. I was so flattered, couldn't believe it, having never even thought of it before. That night, I got an application form, I filled it in and sent it off, all 27 pages of it, before I could lose my nerve. Thus it was that I found myself in a tiny little room at the top of a winding staircase in the House of Lords, being interviewed by a career civil servant. She asked me all sorts of things and then threw me a curveball, really. She said, "How much do you drink in an average week?" She asked, not being a drinker at all, but not wanting to seem pathetic. I told her about the single glass of kiddish wine that I sipped every Friday night. The only reaction I got was a sardonic smile and a raised eyebrow. A few weeks later, I was appointed a deputy district judge, so it can't have done me any harm. It was a part-time role, and a role that you had to undertake for at least 5 years before you could apply to be a full-time judge. My very first sitting as a deputy judge was in 1993 at the tender age of 35. It was a revelation for me. The work felt so natural and so instinctive and so enjoyable that I decided there and then, after the very first hearing, I said to myself, this is what I want to do instead of being a solicitor. And I sat as a deputy whenever I had the time over the next 5 years. In those days, unlike today, you couldn't be appointed to be a full-time judge until the age of 40. I applied at 39, and my appointment as a full-time district judge was officially announced on my 40th birthday, on the very day itself. For a short time, I had the honour of being the youngest judge of any kind in the whole country. So I suppose it was predictable that I would be appointed to sit at Edmonton, where a few years previously the seed of my ambition was planted. Gerald Rose had just retired, and so with great serendipity, I began my judicial career sitting in the very seat that Gerald had so recently occupied. So that's how I got the job. So what do I do? What do I do as a district judge? The job description is that I do civil and family work. Anything Can you hear me? A little sign just came up, David, saying unmute, which I have done. David, can you hear me? I'll carry on. The job description is that I do civil and family work, anything that isn't criminal work. I don't sit with a jury. I sit on my own. I don't have a clerk or a judicial assistant. It's just me, the parties, and if they have them, their barristers, their representatives. I sit in a very ordinary room with a great big long table with one party and their representatives on my left and one party and their representatives on my right. In a civil case, you're not charged with an offence. As a claimant in a civil case, you might sue somebody for a debt. For example, an electrician might sue for his or her fees, or there might be a disputed payment for building works, for example. I also deal with injunctions, which means that the claimant wants to force the other party either to do something or to stop doing something. For example, local authorities take out injunctions to stop antisocial behaviour. I also do family work. This entails sorting out the finances when a couple gets divorced. It also involves deciding where children should live and how often they see the other parent. I also deal with domestic violence injunctions, evictions, housing disputes, rent arrears, return of goods on hire purchase. I approve damages awards for youngsters if they've been injured in a car accident. And a huge amount of my work is adjudicating on who might have been at fault for those car accidents. Small claims up to £10,000 just about cover everything. A ruined holiday, a faulty sofa, or a parking fine, something like that. I also deal with all methods of enforcement, like warrants of execution, calling in the bailiffs, and attachment of earnings. I could go on and on. No wonder it's been said that the office of a district judge is like the post office of the judiciary. There are so many things on offer. A district judge has the widest jurisdiction of any judge in the country. 90% of all the civil work in this country is done by district judges. There are about 500 of us. So you can imagine that the days are always busy and really incredibly varied. So many things to do. We make decisions about an enormous range of civil and family matters. I can have a case which has a value of £20, or the very next case might have a value of £3 million. I might be dealing with a serious child custody dispute, or I might be dealing with a custody battle over a Cocker Spaniel following a couple's divorce. And let me tell you about that last case, because it's a fine example of the sort of weird thing that I do. A husband wanted the family dog back because he said he owned it. The wife said he couldn't have it back because she was caring for the dog who had cancer. And it wasn't, she said, in the best interests of the dog to go anywhere else. I had to tell her that the welfare of the dog was unfortunately irrelevant, and I ordered it to be returned to the husband because contractually the dog was his. The wife had to be helped out of court by her friend because she was weeping uncontrollably. There was a sting in the tail, though. In the end, the husband never did fetch the dog. He never did want the dog. Actually, all he wanted was his day in court. And I'll be talking about the importance of having your day in court later on. It took me about 5 years to find my bearings as a judge. There are two vital skills to being a judge that run in parallel. The first requirement, obviously, is an in-depth knowledge of the law and how to apply it. The second, I think, is more interesting. It's something called judgecraft, which is a much harder skill to acquire. So what's judgecraft? Judgecraft, I say, is the art of judging. It encompasses everything that you won't find in a book on law or evidence practice or procedure. Judgecraft is about how we do the job. So, for example, I might be dealing with a vulnerable litigant. I need to ensure that they understand and can fully take part in the proceedings. I might have a trial where a barrister appears on one side, but on the other side there's a litigant in person without any representation. So I need to ensure that the litigant in person gets a fair hearing and is not disadvantaged in any way because he hasn't got representation himself. Another aspect of this is that I'm always mindful of guarding against something called unconscious bias. You might have heard of that sort of thing, but I'll explain. I'll give you a nice example. A few years ago, I tried a neighbour dispute where one side was seeking an injunction, claiming the other side was noisy, aggressive, and abusive. Into court walked an old man with a walking stick, smartly dressed in a blazer and tie. On the other hand, came in a couple of men with scruffy t-shirts, covered in tattoos, and with very strong, like South London accents like that. Of course, I formed an immediate impression. It was hard not to. But it turned out it was the old man who was the abusive party, and the young men were delightful and had tried their best to befriend and support him. And naturally, they won their case. When I first started, judges were encouraged to take into account someone's demeanour as a way of assessing their trustworthiness. In my judgments, I used to remark on the way in which a witness gave evidence as well as what he or she said. Nowadays, of course, we realise that demeanour is irrelevant and unreliable. You must try the case on the facts and the law and not on impressions. So, what does my day-to-day life as a district judge look like? What happens when I actually go to work? So I like to be in the building in court by about 8 o'clock in the morning. My actual sitting day, that's hearing cases, starts at 10 o'clock and ends at 4 o'clock. So between 8 and 10, I do something called box work. This is when files, court files, are referred to me by the office for decisions or comments, but on the papers. These are things which I can deal with just based on the information I have in the documents in front of me. There's no need to get the parties in. And over the years, I've become incredibly quick at box work, and I can deal with about 40 to 50 pieces of that before 10 o'clock. So I can start sitting at 10, knowing that I've already finished that sort of work for the day. There's also a lot of pre-trial hearings. These are where the judge gets the parties in to go through everything to make sure that they're ready for trial, during which time I can make case management directions, which require generally the parties to do something like exchange documents or send each other their witness statements. But most of my time in court, of course, is taken up with trials. Every case which doesn't settle obviously needs a trial. And a trial might take anything from 1 day to 7 days, and even longer sometimes. A full day trial is actually very, very tiring. The level of concentration you need is absolutely total. You can't relax. It's like chairing a meeting where nobody can agree. You listen for hours, you have to keep everybody on topic, and then at the end of it, you have to sum up what everybody's said and then make a decision on the spot, explain the reason for the decision and the law you applied in arriving at that decision. As you can imagine, I have to make very good notes during the hearing so I can make what they call an extemporary judgment. This means I give judgment on the spot there and then. I don't like to keep the parties waiting. I might ask them to step outside for a few minutes whilst I think about it, but what I want is for them to leave the building with an actual decision. The longest extemporary judgment I've ever given took me over 3 hours to deliver. However, I'll try not to give a judgment after 5 o'clock if I can avoid it. Tired judgments, as I've often been told when I was a very young judge, are very often wrong judgments. It's far better to stop and carry on another day when your mind is fresh. About once a week, I'll have a full day of possession hearings. I might hear maybe 50 cases in a day. They're all rent arrears cases. Some are people that live in council houses and some are privately rented houses. I am acutely aware that each case involves the roof over somebody's head. Sometimes it's very harrowing to make an order that means someone will actually be evicted from their home. But I know that by the time the case has got to me, it's almost certainly at the end of a very long road. However hard the decision might be, I must apply the law and I mustn't be swayed by sentiment. To do otherwise really would be a dereliction of my duty. Every hearing that I do, every hearing is recorded. If someone decides to appeal my decision, it'll go to the circuit judge, that's the level of judge just one above me, who will have a transcript of my judgment to read, and that transcript is typed out from the recording. I once had a case that was appealed all the way to the Court of Appeal, and I'm happy to say I was upheld. I was incredibly relieved, I really was. It was when I was a young judge, and it really boosted my confidence. On another occasion, a litigant complained that I'd been rude, dismissive, and actually aggressive towards her. The tape was sent to the Judicial Complaints Authority, and I'm pleased to say after they listened to the tapes, I was completely exonerated. So I won't sit if the tape isn't going. I just won't start if the tape isn't going, because it's much for my protection as it is a record of the hearing. So what are the essential skills of a judge? As I've said, a knowledge of the law is of course essential. There's also the ability to analyse evidence and to tell the difference between fact and law. One has to be able to listen to the evidence and seek out and sort out what's relevant and what isn't. Because of course not everything that's said to you is absolutely relevant. And it seems obvious, but the job is actually all about making decisions. That's what I say. If somebody asks me, I might say, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's true, what do you do, they say? I'll say, I'm a decision maker. And I say so often to litigants that this isn't a round table meeting. I tell them I'll listen to everybody, and then I'll make a decision, and then I'll give reasons for that decision. It's so important that the litigant, both litigants, everyone who appears before you, who has an interest in the case, feels that they have had their day in court, but they also feel that they've been listened to and that the process has been fair. Fairness is at the heart of everything you do. So let's go back to the idea of judgecraft again. Part of judgecraft is what they call your soft skills. The ability to command authority in your own court is absolutely essential, especially when the participants are challenging. Whatever the parties might think about you, they must know from the start that you're in charge. That's really important. So sitting up straight like that, sitting up straight, very important. Eye contact is important, as is showing you're listening and engaged. It's important to be respectful towards everybody, because everyone, of course, is equal under the law. Your tone of voice is obviously a vital tool of the trade, rather like an actor. Your body language too. So don't lean forward like that. Don't lean forward. It looks as though you can't hear what's being said. Don't peer over your glasses like that. A lot of people think that that's what I should do, but don't do it. It looks as though you're skeptical. It's important to know when to raise your voice, if necessary, or lower your voice to calm the parties when emotions are running high. Many judges can be a bit serious and po-faced about the whole thing. They have what we in the trade call judge-itis. Not me though. For me, humour is also very important. Humour can be unexpected and can lighten the mood, and it can puncture the tension and really is a great release of anxiety. I recognise that I might be making decisions that people don't want to hear, and it's important to deliver those judgments clearly and with as much humanity as possible, giving clear reasons for my decisions so that even if they don't agree with the outcome, people understand how that outcome has been reached and will feel that they've been heard. It might not be fashionable to say it, but I'll say it anyway. A judge has got to sell, if you like, in the broadest sense, his or her decision. So the language used is critical. The language you use in arriving at a decision might be the difference between the losing party accepting your judgment or the losing party feeling aggrieved at your decision. I know that I work for the parties, not they for me. I have a great sense of public service, but at the end of the day, this is my job. It involves a unique set of skills. However, it's not a vocation. I wasn't born to do this. Somebody offered me the opportunity. My mother would tell you differently, but she was biased, obviously. As a very experienced judge, about a third of my time is now spent on judicial business outside of my work. So let me tell you about one or two of the things I do as well. I'm a member of what they call the Civil Procedure Rules Committee. All court work is regulated by procedural rules which deal with the process. It's like a rule book for civil cases. Just as cricket has rules, for example, so does the process of the law. For example, there's a rule about how a claim is validly served. It's nothing to do with the decision-making process. Another rule deals with the whole issue of costs. The Rule Committee is constantly creating and updating and changing these rules. I'm currently chair of a committee which is creating a whole new set of rules to deal with how vulnerable people are treated in court. I also sit on a subcommittee dealing with the rules relating to contempt of court. I'm also an appraisal judge. This means I appraise newly appointed part-time judges. I really enjoy that work. I've done that for quite some time now. I'm a mentor judge, which means I mentor new or younger judges. If they are uncertain about something or just want to discuss their work, they can call me. I also lecture in civil law at the Judicial College, have done for a while. I'm also a member of the Judicial Appointments Commission. This involves being one of the judges interviewing people who themselves want to be judges. The process is much more complex and robust and rigorous than it was when I was appointed all those years ago. Coincidentally, Deborah also works for the Judicial Appointments Commission as a layperson on the panels, but we never work together, obviously, and we never let on that we know each other, despite the fact that we're the only two Cohens on the books. I'm very heavily involved in trialling the new online court process for small claims. It's part of a £1 billion reform project that started about 3 years ago. The idea is to radically modernise the entire judicial system, mainly through the introduction of digital processes. For example, all claims will be done online, it'll be completely paperless, and everything will be in the cloud. Barristers will no longer carry briefs wrapped with pink tape. In fact, virtually every barrister who comes into my court now comes into court with a laptop upon which he or she does all of their work. And the sound of rustling paper has been replaced with the gentle tip-tap on a laptop keyboard. So, coming right up to the present, how has my work changed since coronavirus? The desire to keep the ship of justice sailing was necessary and laudable, but how could it be done? Coronavirus, and in particular the lockdown, catapulted the court system into the 21st century. Overnight, all face-to-face hearings stopped completely. They just stopped dead. We had to find ways of doing hearings without the parties actually coming into the court building. And so after years of procrastination, modernisation and improvements were introduced at dizzying speed. Almost every week, seemingly almost every day, a new piece of software appeared on my laptop to help me do my work remotely. It's been like the Keystone Cops, unbelievable, the rate of change. Things which we would wait 9 months or a year for would just be done overnight. Firstly, a completely new telephone conferencing system was made available within 2 weeks of the lockdown. That was really helpful. The following week, we were introduced to Microsoft Teams, which judges have been asking for years. The latest is something called cloud video platforming, which will allow us to do multi-party video hearings through the laptop. Edmonton County Court, that's my court, has always been my court, was closed at the end of March because a member of staff got coronavirus. And so I'm currently nesting like a cuckoo at Barnet County Court, just down the road, until Edmonton reopens. I haven't seen a single person in my courtroom since the end of March, and all my hearings have taken place remotely. They all actually take place by telephone using this new conferencing system, but there are only certain types of hearings that I can do this way. It's fine for shorter cases where parties aren't actually giving evidence. And so all my trials have been postponed, and the courts now face a massive backlog, which may take 2 or more years to recover. I think the effects of coronavirus actually will remain for the rest of my judicial career and beyond. I've actually been doing telephone hearings for years, but previously, the big difference, it was always between barristers. It was never with litigants in person, never with litigants directly. Litigants in person have no filter, often just no understanding of the procedure and the process, and they feel totally liberated by the fact that they're speaking to a judge that they can't see and who can't see them. So my first attempt at one of these hearings, I have to say, was a total disaster. For an hour, the parties were just screaming and shouting at each other and at me. I completely lost control. But since that first terrible, awful start, I've developed a completely new set of telephone skills in a very short period of time. And now I've got a script that sets the tone and the ground rules for the hearing. So now everybody understands that even though they may be calling from their bedroom or from, I don't know, from work, or they might be wearing their shorts or their pajamas, or eating toast, or even walking along the street, they all know, because I tell them, that it's a proper hearing in a court with serious outcomes. One time, right at the start, when I was still floundering with this new way of working, I was in the middle of a telephone hearing, and the defendant said, "Can you hang on a minute? I've got a customer here." I was so stunned that I actually did hang on. I couldn't believe it. I did hang on. And after 5 minutes, he thanked me for hanging on, and we just carried on. Suffice it to say, I wouldn't allow that to happen now. It's obvious you don't have the same authority on the telephone as you do in a courtroom. More than that, I say, you don't know what's happening at the other end of the phone. For example, I've got no idea if I'm talking to the actual litigant themselves, or if they've got other people in the room with them. If they were with me, I'd know, but I don't know when I'm on the end of a telephone. But sometimes they might have someone in the room nudging them and telling them what to say. I sometimes suspect that the person I'm talking to isn't the actual litigant, but a friend just pretending to be them because the actual litigant is a bit tongue-tied. And they've said to the mate, look, could you do it for me? They won't know. And there's literally nothing I can do about that. At the moment, I refuse to do video hearings involving unrepresented litigants, as do many of my colleagues. The reason is that for trials, when people are giving evidence, I'm not personally comfortable with my face appearing on a computer screen, which can be photoshopped or which can be put up on YouTube or Facebook alongside an audio recording of the proceedings. Of course, they should never do that, but that doesn't stop them. I'm aware that the senior judiciary, the High Court bench, I suppose, have no such qualms because they are doing very large cases involving senior barristers and huge city firms of solicitors, where the risk of, if you like, nefarious activity is virtually nil. But at my level, with angry litigants in person, the dangers are very real. At the moment, I'll do video hearings only when all the parties are represented. When proper safeguards are in place, I'll have no hesitation in conducting video hearings also for litigants in person. You could argue that in some cases a trial conducted in this way remotely isn't a fair trial. There is ongoing research to the effect of remote hearings on litigants. The research shows, and it's in very early stages, but it's quite clear, I think, that many litigants, particularly those who are not represented, don't feel for a variety of reasons that a remote hearing is fair. They think the outcome would have been different if they'd have been able to speak to the judge across the courtroom, face to face in the courtroom. One of the very first remote hearings after lockdown was a case where the judge took a child into care, so removed the child from the parents at a telephone hearing. His decision was rapidly overturned on appeal because the hearing was held remotely and wasn't considered to be human rights compliant. In other words, it wasn't a fair trial. In another long-running case, running over 3 days, quite soon after lockdown, the judge had to decide whether to withdraw medical treatment, which would inevitably lead to the death of the patient. The entire hearing was done on Skype, and it caused huge waves of concern that the judge had just gone too far. After that case, the patient's daughter gave a searing statement about her totally negative experience of the whole remote court process. We don't have time to talk about that case in any detail, but you can look it up if you're interested. There's an article called Skype in the Court of Protection. You can look it up on Google. But the final sentence of the lady's statement went like this. It felt like second best option. It didn't seem professional. It didn't feel like justice. So this is where I'm in complete agreement with the president of the family division when he said, quite profoundly in my view, just because you can conduct a hearing remotely doesn't mean you should conduct a hearing remotely. And I'm very uncomfortable with a lot of what's happening because I think the bar has been set too low in the rush of the court system to keep going. I do understand, of course I do, that needs must when the devil drives, and we couldn't simply close the entire judicial system in this country. But that doesn't stop me feeling uncomfortable about new and unresearched and untested practices that may one day become the norm. There's a qualitative difference between having a hearing remotely and having everybody in the room face to face. In the room, in my chambers, I can use my whole range of skills to ensure fairness, and the litigants can much better interact with me because they're in the same room and free of the other distractions of their lives. In that moment, we're all focused on their case. A remote hearing just doesn't have the same gravitas or sense of occasion as in the courtroom setting. A remote hearing can't reflect the seriousness of some of the decisions that are being made. People may have waited a year or more for their hearing and for their day in court, and I believe that they're entitled to the consideration that comes with the time and space totally devoted to them, with no distractions. For hundreds of years, a court appearance carried with it a sense of occasion and gravitas, which, in my opinion, just has been totally lost for the time being. Finally, and briefly really, what's the future of judging? There's no doubt that the digital age has finally caught up with the court system. The days of paper files and A4 folders are drawing to an end, and that's good for the environment. It increases efficiency, and of course it saves money. The reform project that I talked about earlier has been underway for a number of years, and the effect of coronavirus has accelerated that process. I'm not against change. Some might think I am, but I'm not. And there are some positives to the new ways of working. Remote hearings are useful for case management and for one-off short hearings, in my view. It'll make access to justice much better because remote hearings are available to unrepresented parties at no cost. All they need is a phone and an internet connection. And that must be a good thing. Although I think that face-to-face hearings are the best option, of course, they're the gold standard. I recognise that remote hearings are here to stay and are good for appropriate cases and with proper safeguards. The justice system that I joined nearly 30 years ago will in my lifetime be transformed into a much more streamlined and cost-effective and fair system, as long as everybody is able to access it. It won't be long before I retire, I suppose. Many changes will happen which won't involve me. I'll just be looking on. But I've really enjoyed my career, and I'm very glad I didn't follow the advice of the careers master and instead chose my own path to take up a career in the law. David and everybody, I think I'll finish there, and I'd love to answer any of your questions.
Lawrence, thank you very, very much. I am sure there are going to be lots of questions. There's an enormous amount of very silent applause going on.
Thank you. How can I, David, how can I find out if people are chatting or asking me questions?
I think at the moment you probably can't, but with a bit of luck, I can. So anybody with a question, please wave or make some other sign, and with a bit of luck, I will be able to unmute you. So questions? Nobody on that screen so far. Oh yes, I have. Naomi Brown, according to the name, although I don't think that's exactly you. Can you unmute yourself, please? Right.
Thank you, Lawrence, for that enlightening discourse.
Thanks, Johnny.
I have two questions for you. One is from Liverpool. Was that career master Mr. Flenley?
Yes, it was. Well spotted.
And second of all, on a more serious note, you mentioned that in court, sometimes you have people who become very agitated.
Yeah.
Dare I say, aggressive. What protection do you have? And has it ever come close to being physical?
Yeah. It has been, or come close to being physical on actually one occasion when a chap who was perhaps a metre or so away from me, and I was in the room with him unrepresented and the other litigant unrepresented, and he pulled a knife on me. I was just completely stunned. He stood up. He was about 6'2", 6'3", and he actually, I saw it. He pulled a knife on me, but I think he just wanted to frighten me, and he succeeded. I was so frightened. So what I did, there's a little panic button just underneath my desk. So I pressed that, and that's meant to get the bailiffs in, who I suppose are the court security officers, if you like. And they're meant to rush in and just take the fellow away. And it took, I think, the longest 60 seconds. I mean, really, and I was just rooted to the spot. What I should have done was, to my left, there's what the court system calls my bolt hole, which is in fact just my loo. It's my private little loo. And what I should have done was rushed in there and locked the door, which, and it does lock from the inside. But I was so, you know, when you're so shocked. So I was there. It was like a little standoff, and I was there, he was there, and then the bailiffs eventually came in. What they've done since then is they've put a sort of a big wooden barrier between my desk and the litigants' table. So they're now well over a metre away from me, and they'd have to climb over that barrier in order to get to me. And I've also got a little bit of training, not in hand-to-hand combat, but in actually getting up, going to my left. I've had to practice it. Someone actually watched me do it. I've had to practice rushing into the loo, closing the door, and locking it from the inside. So you'd think I'd have a little bit more protection, but that's just about it. But that's the only time, actually, John, it's ever happened. So
thank you.
There must be something about me or something about them.
Thank you. More questions? Helen. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I'm sure optician's loss is a gain.
Thanks, Helen.
Two questions really. I was a magistrate for 34 years, sitting in a court where, of course, we as members of the community, rather than lawyers, sat as a trio, guided by a lawyer to give us advice if we needed specific law advice. And I wondered how you would compare the work of a district judge with the work of a trio of magistrates appointed by the community.
Okay.
Question, please. And just the other is, we're always taught, although I didn't do family court, the interest of the child is always paramount in family decisions. And I was interested that you chose possibly not the interests of the dog when it came to deciding that the husband should have the dog rather than the wife who was caring for the dog.
Right. So, okay, let's deal with that. Let's deal with the dog first, shall we? The welfare of the dog is different to the welfare of a child, obviously, and it wasn't a welfare decision. I was very tempted to say, because naturally, you know, if one has any sympathy like that, one is tempted to say, well, you can't have the dog because the wife's looking after it and it might die. But in fact, it's just like any other chattel. He might have been asking for a television back or a piece of jewelry or something like that. It just happened to be a live animal. But much as I was tempted to base my decision on the welfare of the dog, I would have been promptly appealed that I'd done so, and I would have been ridiculed, I think, by the judge above me. I had to be, that's an example actually, so it's a good question, of applying the law and being very disciplined. It might be almost, if you like, a counterintuitive decision. You might think, well, clearly the wife has got to keep the dog, but that's not how it was, because contractually it belonged to the husband. So apart from sitting on my own, my work is rather like, not apart from sitting on my own, I sit on my own rather like, if you like, there's something called a district judge magistrates court, which is the old-fashioned stipendiary. People might remember that phrase. I think it's a lovely name, much more romantic than district judge magistrates court. But sitting as a lay panel of three, there's obviously a big difference between me sitting on my own with no advice and a lay panel of magistrates sitting guided by a court clerk. I think that's what they're called, justice's clerk. So that's the big difference. There's three of you, one of me. You're getting some advice, I'm not. You have to retire, I think, and take some advice and come up with a decision guided by the clerk and that sort of thing. So that's the qualitative difference. But here's the similarities. You're still applying the law. I'm applying the law. You listen to the facts, so do I. You have to distinguish between fact and law, so do I. You have to do all those skills, which I have to do on a day-to-day basis. So I'm not just saying this, but I'm fairly lost in admiration, really, for a lay magistrate who has no, apart from the quite basic legal training, doing that sort of work. So really well done. But there are these similarities and the differences.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Goodman. See if I can unmute you, or perhaps you can unmute yourself.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Only just. Can you come closer?
Yes, yes, I can. Oh, just a minute. We've lost it. There we are. Michael Goodman. Right. That was terrific, Lawrence.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
That was terrific. I was a hospital doctor. And when I went to work in America for a couple of years in the mid-70s, they had a newfangled thing called a telephone consultation.
Yeah.
You know, the telephone had been invented around 1880, and by the 1970s, telephone consultation came to America. When I came back to England in hospitals, no, you never did a telephone consultation. Then somebody in Lancaster said, yes, we should do them. And it was called telemedicine, and the Department of Health gave him lots of money. And now, of course, we're at the next stage. But a lot of the drawbacks are balanced, as you said, by cost savings. And I was just wondering, do you know of any broad brush facts regarding the saving to the state, the parties, and so on in a video court rather than a live court?
Well, there are savings not only to the state but also to the parties themselves. Savings to the state means that one can get through a fair amount of work without having even a court building. I can work, if I did all my hearings remotely, they wouldn't even need a court building. And it's a serious point because they're always trying to make savings, and they are, there are a lot of judges now working from home. I mean, just unimaginable before coronavirus. So ultimately, there could be that saving. You could have a sort of a hybrid working system where some judges work from home and some judges work from the court. You don't even need courts, if you like. You can just have conference rooms. You can just have just rooms. Maybe they can even just rent rooms. So there's all sorts of savings to the state. There's also savings for the parties themselves. Just thinking on my feet and putting it sort of broadly, if you have, for example, the parties and their solicitors and barristers all coming to court, that's a much more expensive thing than if the parties and solicitors and barristers are doing it from their front room. The brief fees are lower, the solicitors' charges are lower, they don't have travelling time, all that sort of thing. So there are savings of that sort to be had as well. So there are savings. It's I think a literally and a figuratively cheaper form of justice. So I think the game's not worth the candle. I think you've probably realised that from what I've said. I don't think telephone hearings, apart from the most basic sort of hearings, are really fair. But there's definitely savings to be had. And when there are savings to be had, certainly the Ministry of Justice will go for it. And that's why I think what will happen now is that all of the things that we're doing now will rapidly become the norm, because the Ministry of Justice will sniff cost savings. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Irvin, Cream. Can we unmute you?
Yes, I'm unmuted, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello,
You can hear
Irving.
me? You can hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Good. I thought it was a terrific talk, and I'm amazed at the amount of different work that you have to do in a day. But I wondered really whether you'd met up with any anti-Semitism in the course of your work, and how you dealt with it in such a close, small setting.
I haven't come across, that's a good question actually, I haven't come across any obvious anti-Semitism. It's quite interesting. My court, Edmonton, has Stamford Hill as part of my patch. So they very reluctantly come to court because most of their stuff is dealt with, most of the litigation, if you like, dealt with by the Beth Din. But they do come to the court, and they themselves are very suspicious of the court process, because of course they think that I guess that the senior rule-making body is not my court, but the Beth Din. So there is a part of my patch, if you like, that is very Semitic, but I haven't found at all in my world dealing with non-Jewish people that there is any anti-Semitism. Nobody has called me a name. Nobody has even hinted that my name, which is quite obviously Jewish to anybody who knows that sort of thing, has any bearing on my decisions. In fact, there are, and whisper it, but I'll say it anyway, I think a disproportionate number of Jewish judges. Certainly in London, many of my colleagues are Jewish, and I think they would say the same thing that I've just said, that anti-Semitism is not really a thing as far as the judiciary is concerned. So that's the answer. But can I just tell you something, sort of a funny thing really? When, not on this particular subject, but I'll tell it you anyway. When chaps come in, and ladies, from the Stamford Hill community, but let's say it's men, and they come and appear before me, and they argue their case. And what they do is they argue their case a bit like this. And they say, but Judge, I think you've missed out some, I don't know, I think you've missed out something. What if I said this, what would you say? And try as I might, I cannot avoid beginning to talk in their same voice. So they'll say, Judge, I think you might have missed this out. And I go, I don't think so. I don't think I've missed that out. And they say, well, if I were to say this, what would you say? And I shouldn't be arguing the toss with them, but I say, if you said that, this is what I'd say. And eventually we get through it. And it's rather entertaining. And I cannot stop myself. It's quite, it's weird. It's just, and it's quite funny as well. So, and many of them have come to know me. And they do not try, I think this is why I'll finish with this, they don't try and take advantage of the fact that they might be called Zimmerman and I might be called Cohen. They don't take advantage of that at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I think it's my turn. I shall ask a question, but don't go away, everybody else, because there's more time yet, I hope. Lawrence, thinking particularly about family cases where I guess some of them are actually very urgent and a decision has got to be made.
Yeah.
But you have said you don't like and disapprove of remote hearings. Have you a solution?
Yeah, the solution is to get on with it. The solution is to do it. So an example might be, the obvious example would be that if, say, a young mother has had 2 children, they've both been taken into care, and she's pregnant again, she's in the hospital about to give birth, and the local authority are following the situation very closely. And as soon as that mother gives birth, they're in court. And something has to be done. They believe that the mother isn't, for want of a better phrase, a fit mother, and they have to apply to take that child into care. And you just have to get on with it. You just have to do the very best that you can. That's why it's important, and I mentioned earlier, that it's very important to set the ground rules for the hearing. It's very important that everybody has access to the process. I think it's important, once you've started, to take it slowly and to say that if the hearing is going on and on, to have gaps in the hearing, to make sure that everybody can cope, to make sure that everybody has a proper connection. It's obviously got to be done by video. You can't do that on the telephone. So you've got to hope that the software is right. It actually comes down to that. The reason why the first judge got it wrong, and I was talking about that earlier, was because he was doing it at the end of a 10-hour day. He'd spent 3 hours on the telephone doing this hearing. It wasn't a video hearing, and the young mother did not feel that she could take part in the process at all. For some reason, she wasn't represented, and the whole thing was terribly unfair. But needs must, as I said, and you've just got to get on with it. And there is now a lot of High Court authority, and I'm bound by that, of course, that says in that situation, you can't shirk it. You can't say, well, I just don't think it's fair. I'm the sort of judge who doesn't do this, so either give it to somebody else or I'm not going to do it. No, you've got to do it. You'd be criticised if you don't. It'd be a dereliction of your duty if you don't. So you've just got to get on with it. You've got to hold your nose, I suppose, and put in, as long as there's proper safeguards and as long as you always have in mind the fairness of the hearing. Article 6 human rights says that everyone is entitled to a fair trial, which means a fair hearing. So at the top of your list of do's, if you like, is that there should be a fair hearing. But it's a good question, and you can't say, no, I'm not doing it. If you're next in line, rather like the cab rank, it's yours and you've got to do it.
Thank you. Vicky, let me see if I can unmute you. Yes, I can. Vicky,
Thank you. Hi, Lawrence. You've done a really good chat. I'm really proud of you.
Thank you, sis.
Okay. My question is, bearing in mind how you feel about telephone hearings, have you been given any idea when the courts will go back to be doing face-to-face cases? Would it be possible with some sort of social distancing, with screens, maybe instead of being in your office, maybe in the court setting, something like that? Has anyone come up with anything yet?
It is developing at the moment. The 1 meter rule, although it's a bit confusing, so at least 1 meter, and if you can stay 2 meters apart, then you should do. But you know, because you've been to my court, but not other people don't know. I have the option of
not for a case, Lawrence, not for a case, just to watch.
Not for a case. However, I have the option of sitting in my chambers, which is a small room, or sitting in what we call the big courtroom. The big courtroom, which is what everybody would think of as a traditional court, with benches and that sort of thing, has been measured out very carefully by the court staff and specialists and this sort of thing. But if there was a 2 meter rule, you could still have a trial. It would be a weird trial because if you can imagine the judge and looking out onto those benches, I'll tell you where everybody's sitting. And they're all at least 2 meters away from each other and away from me. The witness boxes to my right and left cannot be used because they're less than 2 meters from me. So on the first bench, extreme left, there's a litigant. Extreme right, there's the litigant's barrister, if there is one. 3 rows behind that, there's another litigant. And on the other end of the bench, so it's about 6 or 7 meters wide, is another barrister. And then right at the back of the court, where you would normally find the public benches, you can get 2 more people. So they would be socially distanced, but although it would be weird, it hasn't been tried, certainly not in my court, you could just about have a trial. There are those brave souls who, for certain trials, are just going for it, and they are having video trials with Microsoft Teams and all of that sort of thing. And I recognise that I am still in the majority, but it's getting close. It's getting close to me being a wuss and everybody else getting on with it. Maybe I'm slightly too long in the tooth, but I'm going to have to bite the bullet eventually. I think by September or October, if things go as they are, I will be doing trials with litigants actually in my courtroom. It'll be odd, but I'll be doing it.
Thank you.
Great. Can we have a last question, and then we can let Lawrence either go and do some more judging or have a cup of tea, whichever is the more important. Lydia Berman is waving at me. Lydia.
Thank you. Lawrence, very informative talk. Thank you. I had two short questions. One is, do you have the opportunity to choose, or will you have the opportunity to choose whether you hear a case on the telephone or by conferencing, or have it in the courtroom? That's my first question.
Yep.
And the other question was, it's well known that youngsters are much more familiar and at ease with telephone conversations and things on Skype and FaceTime and things of that sort. Have you found that to be the case in the cases that you've heard, not face to face?
You mean younger ones as opposed to the slightly elder litigants? Yeah. I'll answer that one. I'll answer that one first. The answer to your question, it's a good question, is yes. They are very familiar with holding a phone, and they I guess they're holding it to their ear or like this. And just for actually a very, very specific example, if I want them to mute themselves, they have to press *6. How do I know that? I just know it. They have to press *6 on their phone. Now, I don't want to upset anybody, but the slightly older person sometimes has trouble with that, because they can't flip between what's on the phone when they are speaking on the phone. And we all know what an iPhone or an Android phone looks like. So you've got to press the home button and then go to the little screen with and all sorts of things. And I know how long it takes them to mute, because I get a little red light when they've done it. And the youngsters, when I say press *6, instantly they're on it and they know what to do. And if they are following my instructions, that's what they do. So they are more familiar. The reverse side of that coin is that they are less respectful. So they are so familiar with the medium that sometimes I think, and I briefly sort of alluded to this in my talk, that they don't take it seriously enough, because it's just, they're on the phone. That's it, they're on the phone. They're walking down the road. It's almost as if it's a phone conversation for them, it's nothing more. But the slightly older person, although they might not be able to manipulate the phone so much, they are more respectful of the process. So it's swings and roundabouts. Your other question about whether I can decide how my hearings go, I very much can. There's a phrase called listing is a judicial function. I'll tell you, the lawyers might know what that means, but I'll explain anyway. Listing means the actual arranging of the cases before you. The actual time and date is done by my office, but I choose the method of the hearing. So if I'm listing a hearing, either at a hearing for another hearing, or in boxwork, I'll say list it for a hearing, I will say the type of hearing that it will be. So I will say, I don't know, list for 3 hours by Microsoft Teams. List for 3 hours must be a face-to-face hearing. List for half an hour on the telephone. So that's what I do. All judges do that. Listing is a judicial function. And there again, because I'm bound by High Court authority and High Court decisions, if you like. That's had the approval, the imprimatur, if you like, very shortly after the lockdown, where a High Court judge said that the decision as to what sort of hearing, what type of hearing is going to be listed is the decision of the judge who will hear that case. So I'm not sort of, the tail does not wag the dog. If you like, I'm the dog and I do the listing. So good question. The choice is mine. Well, you can imagine the sort of choices I'm making at the moment, but that's the sort of thing that will develop over time.
Lawrence, thank you very much. I have, I think, unmuted everybody, or at least I have just tried to, not it seems to be doing anything. But on your behalf and mine, I'd like to thank Lawrence very, very much indeed. And a big round of applause, I'm sure.
Thank you.
As well as thinking that W.S. Gilbert got it right, that he is a judge and a good judge too. I have a delightful vision of Lawrence being long in the tooth while biting bullets, and I'm not entirely sure how that would work. And we have a retired dentist among us, so if necessary, you can consult him later.
Thank you.
Now, before you all go away, for your future delight, in 2 weeks' time, those of you who want to know all about the monkey business behind the elephant enclosure and Ruth Sober's affair with a boa, do come and listen on the 15th of July, when Ruth will be talking about, if it's Tuesday, it's Zoo Day. It isn't actually Tuesday, it's going to be a Wednesday, but it'll still be Zoo Day, so please do come.